and the Marines.
The Bermudez family picked up their photos today, and it was a cheerful moment for Mary, who's not just worried about her husband, but also about her oldest son, who may soon be called out.
It is especially hard right now.
Jessica Aguirre, Channel 6 Action News.
And if you need any more information on any facet of the war in the Gulf, Channel 6 Action News has set up a toll-free Gulf Link hotline. On that hotline, we'll tell you where to turn for virtually any war information that you will need. That number is 1-800-678-WCIX. This toll-free number, provided by Channel 6 Action News and MCI, will be operating 24 hours a day. And we will also be here 24 hours a day, bringing you all the information you need. Right now, let's go back to CBS News in New York for more on the continuing war in the Gulf.
The story, Showdown in the Gulf. Dan Rather.
Military buildup continues at full throttle.
CBS News.
As a crisis builds.
Saddam Hussein cannot...
Agonizing decision.
John Hambrick.
It's got to be very tense right now for our troops.
Channel 6 Action News.
Concerned citizens who are packed.
President met with 7.
From the Middle East to South Florida, experience counts. Channel 6 Action News.
I'm John Hambrick. All branches of the military service are operating toll-free telephone numbers to help family members of service personnel. For the Army, call 1-800-542-9254. The Navy, 1-800-732-1206. The Marines, 1-800-523-2694. The Air Force, 1-800-253-9276. And for the Coast Guard, 1-800-283-8724. Channel 6 will continue to bring you important information throughout this crisis. I'm John Hambrick. The Vet Center Crisis Line is open 24 hours a day to help family members of service personnel. Call 646-VETS or 523-7660.
Channel 6 Action News. We're earning our reputation, one story at a time.
You're watching CBS News continuing coverage of Showdown in the Gulf. From CBS News headquarters in New York, here are Harry Smith and Paula Zahn.
And good morning, everybody. I guess it's hard to figure out who's going to be on the shift because we're changing throughout the night. Welcome back to our special coverage of Operation Desert Storm. I'm Paula Zahn.
And I'm Harry Smith, and here are the Persian Gulf headlines this morning. 2 more American planes down. Israel looks for an answer to an Iraqi missile attack. Moscow denounces the attack as a dangerous turn, and Allied ground forces are on the move in Saudi Arabia. There are 2 more American planes down in the Gulf War. One is identified as an Air Force F-15E Strike Eagle carrying 2 crewmen. The other is a Navy attack plane, an A-6 Intruder, also a 2-man aircraft. Both crews are listed as missing. In Israel, the cabinet has ended an emergency session this morning in Jerusalem. They met to decide on a response to an Iraqi Scud missile attack. At least 8 missiles hit Haifa, Tel Aviv, and other coastal areas. They did not carry chemical weapons, but their conventional warheads did considerable damage. 10 people were hurt, none killed. American officials are urging a cautious response from Israel, but the Soviet Union has denounced the Iraqi attack as a dangerous turn in the Gulf War. Allied planes continue their round-the-clock attacks on targets in Iraq and Kuwait. But planes are not the only weapons in the air war. Tomahawk cruise missiles have been used since the very beginning, their first use in combat. The Pentagon is pleased with the results, and are so the sailors aboard the battleship Wisconsin who launched the missiles.
We are certainly prepared to continue the fight, and that is why I think we very carefully built up the forces in theater and put them in place such that when we were ready to go, we were ready to continue the fight and take the fight to its natural conclusion.
In Saudi Arabia this morning, there are signs that the Allies are preparing for a ground war. Trucks and armor are now moving in convoy toward the Kuwaiti border. In this country, the protests continue. One at a basketball game in Missoula, Montana, brought a response from the crowd. The protesters delayed the start of the game for about 5 minutes, and that for right now is the headlines.
And to find out more about that troop movement along the Kuwaiti border right now, we go to Scott Pelley, who's standing by in Bahrain, Saudi Arabia. Good morning, Scott. What can you tell us?
Good morning, Paula. This morning we are at a air base in eastern Saudi Arabia, and we have been watching all morning as U.S. Air Force F-15 Eagles have been leaving here, apparently inbound to Kuwait and Iraq. The aerial bombardment of Kuwait and Iraq continues at this hour. As for those troops that you mentioned, Paula, we saw it yesterday. Hundreds of U.S. tanks, armored personnel carriers, and other equipment massing on the Kuwaiti border. This was in conjunction with British forces. Long convoys of fuel trucks and ammunition trucks were headed into the area. It is not known when those troops may be moving north. Let's speak for a moment about U.S. air losses at this moment. Overnight, the United States lost 2 more aircraft. 4 crewmen are missing. The first, a U.S. Air Force F-15E Strike Eagle, top-of-the-line aircraft, apparently downed during a mission over Iraq or Kuwait. 2 men listed as missing. The other aircraft, a Navy A-6 Intruder, a bomber that would have been launched from one of the 6 aircraft carrier battle groups in the region. 2 men aboard that aircraft also listed as missing. And finally, the first aircraft lost in the air war against Iraq, an FA-18, 1 man aboard that aircraft listed as missing. There was a Scud missile attack here in Saudi Arabia last night at about the same time as the attack in Israel. We have videotape now of an American Patriot missile knocking down the incoming Iraqi Scud missile. You see the orange streak rising into the sky, and just above the cloud layer, the Patriot missile impacts the Scud and brings it down. Standing here last night during that air raid, we could hear the Patriot missile take off, and only about a second and a half later, a loud bang and concussion as that Scud missile was brought down. It was the first time the U.S. Patriot missile system had ever been used in combat, and it scored a direct hit. Also this morning, the aerial bombardment continues from the sea. In the Persian Gulf, the battleship USS Wisconsin continued firing salvos of Tomahawk cruise missiles. These are the super accurate missiles aimed at Kuwait and Iraq that are taking out high priority targets such as the anti-aircraft systems that have been used to some effect to bring down American aircraft so far. Paula?
Scott, can you give us a better sense of the distances these troops are going to have to travel, those that are heading north now to the Kuwaiti border?
Not very far at all, Paula. We were taking a trip, if you will, along the Kuwaiti-Saudi border yesterday. Me and a CBS crew went about 200 miles along the border and saw U.S. forces massed about 40 miles from the border. It would be a very quick trip indeed to bring an armored thrust into southern Kuwait.
Scott Pelley reporting from Saudi Arabia and Dhahran, Saudi Arabia this morning. Thank you very much. Right now we're going to go to Wyatt Andrews, who's standing by at the White House with the latest from Washington. Good morning, Wyatt.
Paula, good morning. With reference to the attacks last night by Iraq on Israel with the 8 to 10 Scud missiles that hit throughout Israel, the White House was engaged throughout the night in a furious diplomatic effort to try to assure the Israelis that strictly from a military point of view, the U.S. would be doing what it could to act in Israel's self-defense. The obvious implication there is a clear effort to persuade the Israelis that restraint now is in Israel's best interest, and that from a military point of view, the U.S. could answer the Scud attack. Even the public hints coming from the White House overnight were huge, with the White House saying in written statements that the Allies would continue their efforts to eliminate the threat, quote unquote, and that the United States is attacking those missile sites and other targets in Iraq. The concern, Paula, is obvious that Israel could, and that Israel knows this for itself, that Israel would only be playing into Saddam Hussein's hands if it made a very huge showing or a non-commensurate response to what happened last night. It would only play into what Saddam is obviously attempting, and that is to portray himself as the champion of the Palestinians. There's no doubt that Israel itself knows that's exactly what's going on, and the United States, while falling short of asking Israel never to defend itself, is obviously asking Israel to weigh this very carefully.
But if Shamir caves in to pressure from the right and his party and it does decide to retaliate, how is this going to change the stakes of the war?
Well, that, Paula, depends completely on what Israel does. Even from the Syrians and on the record from the Egyptians, if Israel retaliates in kind, I believe the word that I've consistently heard is commensurate. Will the retaliation be commensurate? Then the jury will really be out as to whether Israel would damage, quote unquote, the coalition. If Israel were to go for some massive retaliation, take on Baghdad, go for Saddam himself, that's the situation in which the Egyptians and Syrians might be given pause in their contributions to the coalition.
Are we getting any better information now on just what the coordination will be in the coming days between Israel and the United States?
Paula, to be perfectly honest, no. I think that we've been in a situation over the last few days where the Israeli public complaints that they had no coordination with Washington being so loud. I think that in some cases you might even suspect that. It's very hard to believe that there would be no coordination. And I think it's clear from the activity around from the White House last night that the coordination last night, at least, was significantly stepped up.
Wyatt Andrews, thanks so much from the White House this morning. Harry?
Paula, we want to talk with a couple of veterans, one a Vietnam veteran and one a Korean War veteran who are involved in Veterans Affairs. And before we talk about what you all do with regard to that, I wanted to ask you a little bit about some of your own personal reactions and how you've been responding as you saw the beginning of the battle take place, and what is that like for you to see another war start? Let me start first with Gene Gittleson, who's a Vietnam War veteran. We're also joined by Eddie Thompson, who's a Korean War veteran. Gene, let's start with you.
It stirs memories because young men and women, young men like myself, 20 years ago, going into combat, the uncertainty of the situation, and it also brings back the memories that we very much prepare people for war. We're very good at putting people through basic training and advanced individual training through all our wars, but we're not very good in preparing people to come home. And the thoughts that I had was, what's going to happen? Is it going to be like Vietnam? Is it going to be like Korea in coming home?
Because you're involved with a Veterans Leadership Project here in New York City. And isn't that part of what that's all about, is to help people continue in their adjustment to even all these almost 20 years later?
Yes. In fact, right now we have over 900 Vietnam veterans on the waiting list who are still waiting to get back into the economic mainstream. We haven't finished the job for that war, and now we have other soldiers who at some point are going to be coming home. Mm-hmm. And have we learned? Or is it collective amnesia again when soldiers come home?
Eddie, what was your personal response as this war started?
Well, not much different than what Gene was saying. I had some old feelings and thoughts and remembered, or I'm getting ready to go into another battle. I didn't want to see this happen. But if we are into it, I said, let us win this one the right way. Let us have a lot of respect for our guys and girls when they come home. And the other thing is, are we prepared when it's over? I think some thought should go into it about when our men and women come home, what the future will hold for them, definitely emotionally and job-wise. And I deal with a lot of vets in the program that I work for, which is a substance abuse program. And I see all the emotional traumas.
Do you think that the nation is better prepared for this war, or at least initially? I mean, we see the poll numbers that there's so much support for the president, and even amongst protesters, you're hearing people say, we support the men and women who are fighting over there. We may disagree with the policy, but we support the men and women who are fighting over there. That's a big difference from 20 years.
It's a very big difference, because what we found did not happen when we came home was the war was not separated from
the people who fought.
From the people who fought. And it's been a problem throughout history, from the Civil War, World War I, II, Korea, and Vietnam. And the question is whether the past is prologue, or whether we have really learned that when we put people into combat, soldiers don't make war. They conduct the foreign policy of the nation, and we've got to remember that.
Eddie, do you see, as you listen to the families of servicemen and women over there, though, they seem to be coping well? As we've seen interview after interview after interview, as well as these military people seem to be prepared. I also see a different kind of preparedness from the families.
Yes, and a lot more support for the families. I see, and I hope that will continue, and young children also of these guys and the women, and but still to go back, I just hope we have learned a lesson in the support of our people when we come back.
In your substance abuse program and your support program to get people more involved in the economic mainstream of the veterans that you've been in contact with over the last 48 hours or so, has this been especially traumatic for some?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Eddie.
Yeah, I see it with the people that I work with and the people that we are treating in the program. A lot of trauma was there, a lot of emotions came about. And a lot of the people where I work at have relatives there, brothers, sisters, or children, their own child. And we have a lot of discussions around it.
Yeah, they must be feeling it especially intensely.
Yeah, what we see, Terry, I mean, wars produce stress reactions. It's not unusual. It is not pop psychology. It is a reality, whether it's hurricanes. The question is, what are we going to do about it? And since time does not necessarily heal those wounds, talking about it, working on it, acceptance, coming to terms with it does. And whether it's 20 years or 1 year, we have got to learn to allow the people that come back to talk about it, to accept that.
And I think it's through work of gentlemen like you that the country's awareness is a lot higher. Gene, Eddie, thank you.
Thank you
very much for coming in this morning. I do appreciate it.
Okay.
And our coverage of Deborah's storm will continue right after this. I guess we're not going to take a break after all. I'm going to bring you up to date on the headlines in the Persian Gulf War. 2 more U.S. jet fighters are down. The Israeli cabinet concludes debate following an Iraqi missile attack. The U.S.-led air assault continues on targets both in Iraq and Kuwait. And the commander of Operation Desert Storm will brief reporters about 1 hour from now. Details are sketchy, but 2 more U.S. jet fighters are reported down in action. One is a Navy A-6 Intruder. No official word on the fate of its 2 crewmen. The other missing jet is an Air Force F-15E Strike Eagle. Its 2-man crew is also unaccounted for. The Israeli cabinet has concluded a lengthy emergency meeting called to formulate a response to last night's Iraqi missile attack. No decision has been announced. At least 8 conventionally armed Iraqi Scud missiles hit Israeli civilian targets, 5 in the city of Tel Aviv, causing damage and injuries, but fortunately no deaths. Shortly after the missile strikes, the mayor of Tel Aviv surveyed the wreckage.
My feeling is, look, I mean, war is not a summer camp, and to my sorrow, people were wounded. We are taking care of the families, of the babies, of the children. I went to, because the people are now they were concentrated in 2 shelters, in a school and in another place. I went to calm them down, to speak with them, to tell them that we will take care of them. We'll evacuate them from here, we'll give them housing, and we will continue to live and to enjoy life.
In the Iraqi capital of Baghdad, all appears quiet this morning. Some street traffic is visible in some of the most recent pictures we've been sent. That's in stark contrast to the battle that lighted up the Baghdad skies Wednesday night. These spectacular pictures were smuggled out of Iraq by a British ITN cameraman. And Harry, I can't imagine what he was thinking as that was unfolding and his camera was rolling.
We are going to get a little bit more military analysis now. And once again, we're joined by CBS News correspondent, 60 Minutes correspondent Morley Saber. Good morning, Morley.
Thank you, Harry. More Tomahawk cruise missiles were launched by U.S. warships at Iraqi targets in Basra last night. Desert Storm is war like it's never been fought before, using weapons that were never tested in battle. It's kind of Star Wars for real. To get an idea of its like, we have some quite fascinating footage of last night's launching of a cruise Tomahawk missile from the Wisconsin. Well, we will have some fascinating footage of a cruise from Wisconsin. David Aarons, a cruise missile, never before used in anger. What's its brain like? How does it know where to go?
Well, it really has three different components. One is a sort of inertial guidance system where that's similar to a number of inertial systems that are in commercial aircraft and so forth. Then it has what is called contour radar mapping. In other words, it goes along and it has in its brain a map of what the contour of the land is as it heads towards its target, and it keeps taking measurements to know where it's supposed to be. Then in its final phase, it actually has a picture in its electronic brain of what the target is supposed to look like.
But so what you're saying, if they're launching one from Wisconsin, say, to hit the defense ministry in Baghdad, theoretically, somebody's programmed into it that roadmap to Baghdad through the defense ministry in Baghdad.
It's even more than a roadmap. It's like a scale model, if you will, of what the whole land and the territory is between its launch point and when it arrives. And it actually has a picture of the defense ministry. The one that struck that could well have had a TV camera in it that would match the actual picture of the ministry with the picture in its electronic brain. It's able to land after traveling more than 600 miles. It's able to land within 10 yards. So it's an extremely accurate and impressive system.
Let me interrupt because we do have the tape now of that launching from Wisconsin last night.
This is Bravo, direct. ECO, time until launch, 1 minute. 1 minute to launch. 1 minute, sir.
ABL-1, unlocked.
Battle ready as possible. You might be unable to support boarding until earliest morning on the 19th.
ABL-1, elevating.
Alert acknowledge. Recommend ships closer. Execute plan 10. 5. Okay, Yankee Mike. I'll say again.
4, 3, 2, 1. Launch.
Missile away.
Yes, sir. Good job. Congratulations.
Well, we're going to need to do a LCTV.
I think you heard a few bragging rights. There's 2 aircraft in there, and there's 3 missiles in between. This is ours.
It's fascinating looking at modern warfare. None of those, great artillery barrage, great cannon barrages from ships offshore. It's this.
I think one of the most impressive things about this whole thing is that with all of those missiles, we've had to take radar pictures of the entire country of Iraq. We've had to get these pictures of the targets. We've had to get them into the specific missile system's brains. And this has been an intelligence and coordination effort of enormous magnitude.
You know, over the years, we've all done wonderful stories about weapons that don't work, excessive overruns for weapons that don't work. Here in the last 2 days, we've had 2 absolutely new weapons, never used before, that actually work, Patriot and the Cruise. You think the military-industrial complex is cheering this morning?
Well, you know, there have always been a lot of very good people out there working very hard and doing a good job for the country. It's also instructive that both of these programs have been pretty successful all the way along. In other words, they've not been troubled programs that required, that had massive cost overruns. They're very expensive weapon systems, but the programs have gone ahead on schedule. They haven't been like some of the programs that, for example, Dick Cheney just canceled a few weeks ago.
Well, it was proven yesterday that a Scud is easy to knock down with a Patriot. How easy is it to knock down a Tomahawk?
Well, it wouldn't be all that difficult. If you had a Patriot on the other end, you could intercept a Tomahawk the way that we intercepted the Scud. In fact, I think it's fair to say that it might even be easier because it doesn't fly. It's not a ballistic system. It's really a winged aircraft, a pilotless aircraft. And the possibility of intercepting it and shooting it down is very real.
It also doesn't go in a straight line, though.
No, it maneuvers and it can do various things. But essentially, it's, you know, like the old V-1 buzz bomb and can be shot down by anti-aircraft.
Thank you, Dave.
Wally, thank you. CBS continuous coverage of Operation Desert Storm continues in a moment.
now hearing that the Pentagon is taking in some 10,000 calls an hour from family members wanting to know the latest information. And right now we go to Bob Faw for some domestic reaction to the news of the last 24 hours. Good morning,
24
Bob.
going on 36, Paul. The war, you know, reveals the deepest and often the truest emotions of a nation, noble as well as base. One way to get a sense of what's going on is to spend a few minutes with a family living through the war, in this case with a proud but worried father at home and a son who's on the front lines. His name is Lieutenant Colonel Mike Hostage. He's 35 years old. He's now a fighter pilot on duty in Saudi Arabia. He's the product of an all-American life, glory on the gridiron, golden moments in the sun, the happy marriage, the smiling wife. Mike Hostage's nickname now is Hijack, and while he flies over Baghdad, his father at home outside Boston tries to stay calm.
As Mike describes his job, he is the point of the spear. His job is to be out front in the attack.
Yeah, we were expecting to see air activity, being daylight and such, but I was kind of surprised that there wasn't any.
I said something as we were saying goodbye. I said, "Be careful, and I love you." And he said, "I'll be careful. I love you too, and don't forget that I'm very good at what I do, and I'll be very careful."
Well, I've been training for 13 years for this day. It's like being a professional athlete and never playing a game. Today was the first game, and the enemy didn't show up. The opponent didn't show up. We went out there and ran our first play, and it worked great. Scored a touchdown. There was nobody home.
Unfortunately, it isn't over. It's begun. And for as long as they're there, I'm told he'll fly 2 missions a day. And you just have to worry each day.
Think the war's over?
I would not be surprised. If he had a half a brain, he'd quit before we do him any more damage. I would not be surprised at all if it ended quickly.
The war, mostly at this point, a question of tactics and ordnance, but the war is essentially about human beings, as that shows very clearly. Harry? Paul?
Bob, a little bit earlier this morning, I saw you on with Charles Osgood, and you were talking about some poll numbers that I have a copy of, too. And one wonders about how the country responds, and that's one family's response. And the numbers are overwhelming in their support for the president and for support for the policy.
3 of 4, Harry, nearly 78%, wholeheartedly endorse what the president has done. But keep in mind, that happens every time this country goes to war, at least in the art of polling, that happens. It happened with Grenada, it happened with Panama, it happened even after the Libyan jets were shot out of the sky, the tendency to rally behind the president. The question here is when the body bags come home, when the cost goes up and the apparent cost is clear to everyone, do those numbers stay as high? Korea, 2 years after the conflict began there, those numbers plunged 40%. Same thing happened in Vietnam, only faster. So this is early. This is the best they will get. The president now, according to the poll numbers, the CBS New York Times poll, is almost at his record high level. Mm-hmm. Will it stand up? Will the family we just talked to feel the same way a month from now? That's the key question.
When was this polling done?
On the 17th of January. So before the Israeli attack, the attack that is on Tel Aviv, which some people think has hardened attitudes already, but still, this is the early glow. This is the first round, and this is what, at this point, is reflected in that poll.
The numbers really stand up all the way through, too, as I've got a copy of the poll in front of me. Do you approve or disapprove of the way George Bush is handling Iraq's invasion of Kuwait? 85%.
Staggering.
Do you think the United States did the right thing in starting military actions against Iraq? 78%. And these match up dramatically with same questions that were asked 10 or so days before. I mean, there are jumps, dramatic leaps of 20, 25, even 30%.
Again, keep in mind 2 things. The poll also shows that most Americans, about 36%, do not think this conflict will drag on more than a couple of months. Earlier in January, that figure was about 24%. So there is a feeling this is going to be over quickly, and that's reflected in the poll. Keep in mind also that there's a gender gap in this poll. By a margin of a ratio of about 2 to 1, men who were polled said, go into Iraq, bomb the targets regardless of where civilians are. Only 41% of the women polled felt that way.
Dude, I haven't had a chance, and these things get to be unbelievably complex and go page after page after page. And I'm wondering if there is also a generation gap. In some of the early indications, they're really, the older the American, the more supportive of the president and the policy, and the younger, just the opposite.
Yeah, and that's, again, a traditional historical pattern, which tends to hold up. That support tends to hold up over time for the administration, whereas the younger support, which presumably bears a greater brunt, tends to fall off. Again, it's just too early. The point I think we can make is that the overall rating now for what the president has done is probably, if past polls are any guide, is probably as high as it's going to go.
The other thing I'm curious about is this is all taken this is the initial blush, and especially through the success of the early hours of the campaign, is so much more infinitely complex now after the Scud missiles landed in Israel last night. And we're all sort of waiting on the edges of our collective seats to find out what the Israeli cabinet decides to do with regard to some sort of retaliation or not.
Do you suspect as a result of the attacks now on Israel that we will see these numbers go even higher?
Well, I think there's some sign already, given the reaction around the country in the last several hours to what has happened in Tel Aviv. The sense of outrage and indignation seems to be building, even though people knew it could happen. So the finality of it has solidified support already. The question is whether that initial blush will carry over. And I think that's an open question right now. It's a broad base of support, but at the same time, one could say it's also thin. Sounds contradictory, but it isn't.
Bob Falk, thanks very much for joining us this morning, and we'll be getting back to Bob, I'm sure, with more information throughout this morning as our continuous coverage of Operation Desert Storm continues.
And good morning. Welcome back to our special coverage of Operation Desert Storm. I'm Paula Zahn.
And I'm Harry Smith.
Time to bring you up to date on the latest headlines right now. 2 more U.S. jets downed in the air war with Iraq. Israel's cabinet debates an answer to an Iraqi missile attack. The PLO says the Iraqi attack puts Israel in the war. And the U.S. commander in the Gulf prepares his first briefing for reporters since Desert Storm began. Officials in the Persian Gulf confirmed this morning that there are now 3 American planes down in the Gulf conflict. The latest losses: an Air Force F-15E, known as a Strike Eagle, with a crew of 2, and a Navy attack plane, an A-6 Intruder, also carrying a 2-man crew. Both crews are reported missing. That's about all we know at this point. The first plane lost in the initial wave of attacks was a Navy F-18. Its pilot, Navy Lieutenant Commander Michael Spicer, is officially listed as missing. In the skies over Israel, warplanes are on the alert after an Iraqi missile attack. They have not yet been ordered to do anything that we know of. Like the rest of the world, they're waiting to hear what the Israeli cabinet decided at an emergency session this morning in Jerusalem. The Iraqi Scud missile did not carry chemical warheads, but they did a great deal of damage. At least 10 people were hurt, none killed. In this country, the Israelis are being asked to show restraint in answering Iraq.
If the Israelis respond, put considerable strain on the coalition. I think that may have been the back of everyone's mind when you listen to Saddam Hussein over the past 3 or 4 months.